What is the hardest interview questions that I've been asked? So a lot of them are case oriented. Okay, so what that means is this. They provide you with a case, a real situation, and you have to solve that case or give your thoughts. And a lot of the times the people interviewing you are going to give you real business problems they're working on. They want to use you for your ideas. Okay, it's a symbiotic meeting. They both benefit, but they change the name of the company. So, for example, when I interviewed at the Boston Consulting Group, BCG, in Toronto back in 1995 when I was working at Accenture. When I interviewed there, BCG asked me, questions about the Toronto Sun, which is a big newspaper in Canada. And I think that their client at that time was the Toronto Star. Okay, and they asked me, how do we increase viewership for the Sun? And my answer was awful. I wasn't prepared. But the way that you answer all questions in all interviews is you provide them with a framework. It's like a crutch. And I teach about this in my complete job course. And so what you do is this. You have a framework in your mind. It might be the SWOT analysis framework, SWOT, which is strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And so had I used that framework at the time, I could have said, let me kick it off with the strengths for the Toronto Sun. The strengths are blah, 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 blah. Moving on to the weaknesses of the Toronto Sun. The weaknesses are blah, 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 blah. In terms of the opportunities, online's a great opportunity for thesun.com, whatever it might be. Okay. And lastly, threats. I think the biggest threat to the business model longer term is. Now, you see what I just did there? What I did was I offered you a framework and I gave transition words in between, like in terms of. Moving on to, lastly, let's discuss, that sort of thing. When I discuss those transition words there, when I mention them, I'm actually thinking of what the answer is. Okay, I'm providing structure so that the person interviewing me understands that I have a well thought out answer. And I'm also buying time as well. And a lot of teachers do this. I know because I used to do this. I'll be in class and somebody will ask me a tough question. And I'll say, the question was this. Or if I'm on a webcast, what happens, a lot of companies that do webcast meetings, they say the question for the webcast was this. They're buying time so they can think of the right answer. So make sure you have a framework in place. Other frameworks you can use, and we had questions earlier on this call on marketing. You can use the Boston Consulting Group framework as well. Okay, and I did not get the job at the BCG or Boston Consulting Group because I was just rambling on and on and on without a framework. So aside from the BCG framework, moving on to other frameworks to talk about, see, I'm buying time. You can also use the product lifecycle framework, PLC. What phase is that company or that product in? Is it introductory phase or growth phase, maturity phase, or in decline, and why? So always use frameworks and you'll be able to answer questions very well. Another thing I found in interviews is there's an interview tactic where they'll ask you a lot of questions and they'll keep drilling down to see how you react under pressure when you can't answer a question. Here's how you do it. For example, at Goldman Sachs, back in 1998 in July when I interviewed there, and I was nervous, but I prepared a lot. One of the questions was this. What markets, Chris, do you follow? And I mentioned a bunch of markets. Okay. Then they say, well, what markets in Europe? And I said, well, the DAX, which is the German index, the CAC 40, French. I know my accent's not great. The FTSE in England, that sort of thing. And they said, okay, well, name a company on the DAX that you follow. And I said, Daimler Chrysler. And then they said, okay, who's the CEO of Daimler Chrysler? And I said, well, it's Jürgen Schrimp. And they said, well, who's the CFO? And I said, I don't know, but I'll get back to you. Okay, so you don't BS, right? You write it down. And then later on that day, right after your interview is done, immediately send an email saying, thank you very much for your time. I enjoyed our conversation. In terms of your question on who the CFO was of Daimler Chrysler, it is this person. Thanks again, Chris. You send that email out right away when you're done. And I'll tell you why. So after somebody interviews you, they have to fill out a form internally. It's either online or they do it on paper. But they don't do it right away because you're not as important, or I'm not as important to them as their daily job. So before they finish for the day, before they go home, they fill in the survey. Now, if they got that email from me answering the question and saying thank you in the subject line, that will bias them to be more positive on that survey. It shows that I'm polite, I follow up, I'm responsive, and I'm proactive at the same time. So those are just a couple of ideas and frameworks to use when you're in an interview. If you want to talk about them in more detail, I'm happy to do so, or you can take my course called The Complete Job Course. Thanks.